without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Professor Maureen Fordham. Maureen is the Director of the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction at the University College of London. She's also the coordinator of the International Gender and Disaster Network. She's currently working on an online encyclopedia of gender hazards and disasters for Oxford University Press, and we're absolutely delighted to have Maureen with us today. Maureen, it's incredibly early over there. We're so glad that you've been able to join with us, and we've got a presentation for that Maureen will now talk to you about. Over to you, Maureen.
Thank you, Tanya. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Good. Just to say, I'm the director of the Centre for Gender and Disaster, which is one of the research centres within the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, so that's IRDR. So my colleague Peter Salmons, who is the boss of the Institute, wouldn't thank me for saying I was the director of the whole thing.
Don't worry, I love to uptitle people, Maureen.
We won't tell them. So thank you for the opportunity to talk. And I didn't really know where to begin on this, I have to say, because there's so much that we could be saying. And I didn't want to just give you a list of this disaster did this and this disaster did that and a bunch of data. So this is how I thought I would talk about it, because I think one of the key issues particularly for women in disasters, but not only women, is this problem around silencing and invisibilizing. And in fact, that's where I came into this whole business of working on gender and disaster back in the early 1990s, because women seem to be invisible in disasters. So myself and a few other people got together and tried to make them a bit more visible. So what I thought I'd talk about is really what you'd asked for around gender, around violence, around recovery. But I have to say that they are all niche areas. They're all niche areas in social science research. Only a minority of people work on gender in disaster research, and there's only a minority of those work on violence. And then there's recovery, which is always a kind of problem area. And of course, now we are viewing everything within this COVID-19 context, which is still very new. And we have data, but a lot of it is not good. We'll have to wait a while to see what turns out to be the right data, but we're getting the dominant messages, we're getting a picture of this disaster. And I know that the talk is around the global and the local, but when you come down to it, you know, disasters are always local at the point where they impact people. And it underlines really why people's stories are so important. And that tends also to be a little bit niche at times, because people are after the data. They want the hard data, they want the numbers, but how we really get to understand it is through the stories of people who go through disasters. So I want to highlight issues around silencing, invisibilizing, and the problems of those who are not heard or seen, but also mention that some people stay silent for a good reason. And throughout all of this, violence is an often invisible thread. It's a relatively new area, relatively now, to disaster research. And we can talk about that a bit more, about why that would be the case in a minute. And issues around recovery, which tend to come at the end, if you're looking at disaster stages. And I know all the problems with disaster stages, but the problem with recovery is it tends to be at the end of the line, and it actually is important to start early. So we should be planning now for recovery out of COVID. And I don't mean that in a Boris Johnson kind of way of getting people back to work, whatever the cost it would seem. I'm just talking about the planning, the thinking, the preparing, and the joining up of recovery to all the other parts of the disaster management system. And in doing that, and in viewing recovery and planning for it, the important thing is also to recognize local differences and respecting those. And the other thing I'll get onto is around building social ties, what's called in the academic literature social capital. So we move on to recovery, and I'll say something as we go through about social ties, and a bit later also about social infrastructure. So I don't know if you agree, but to me it always seems that recovery is the poor relation in the disaster field. Disasters, the kind of disasters that we're often talking about, the big disasters, the major disasters, they, by their very nature, they tend to bring external people in, and that can be a problem in the way it disrupts local working, local organization. And the problem with the recovery period is that disaster responders go home because disaster now moves out of that crisis period into recovery, which merges very much with the everyday, and the people who get involved in recovery are often different to those who've been involved in the crisis period. That's not always the case, and of course there are no clear boundaries from one stage to another, but I'm speaking kind of general principles here. And there I've seen many examples of where information and knowledge and understanding is lost because those who've been involved in the crisis period have gone, and those who have now brought in to now take over the recovery have not had the same experience and have not listened to the same stories. And then people who've been through a lot of trauma are forced to speak their stories again when they don't choose to do so. So there are a lot of problems with the lack of a kind of joined up system often. And this is worse in these large scale disasters. Women's role in all of this varies. It tends to be that once recovery kicks off in terms of let's rebuild the big infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, that often women are sidelined in the big projects. And while they may have very significant roles at a local level, that also gets sidelined as people are keen to rebuild the economic base, but to do it in a very particular way. I'll get back to that in a minute. Although I'm talking about gender, I'm not just talking about gender. So it's about people in all of their diversity. So yes, women are not a minority group, although that they're often treated in that way. So they might not be seen, heard, or counted, and often that's because we don't have sex or gender disaggregated data because of all sorts of reasons. What's interesting, I think, about the COVID crisis is that we tend to have better, at least sex disaggregated data, if not gender disaggregated data. And I think that's because it's a health emergency, and the health sector is much better actually about collecting and then disseminating sex disaggregated data. So we know from so many disasters around the world that it's very typical for women, and I'm focusing on women, even though as I say elsewhere, gender does not equal women alone, but women typically are excluded from decision-making arenas and from a lot of the important planning arenas. It's quite common for some specific sex-related, sexual and reproductive health particularly, needs, interests to go unrecognized, to go unaddressed. And of course, we also know that women may carry this unequal burden in the post-disaster period, because they may be juggling, holding down a job, or quite often more than one part-time job, whilst also managing a family, a home, and often also with significant community involvement. And what they do tends to carry less value because it's just what women do. So there's a lot of inequality throughout this whole system. So yeah, women are not just women, and gender doesn't equal women only. So increasingly now, we think, or we try to encourage other people to think intersectionally. So we're trying to think about women and men and other genders in all their diversity. And that is a real challenge for people who have to manage disasters. And whenever you throw this one at them, they say, look, you know, it's bad enough just trying to factor one group in, women in, and then people with disabilities, and now you're going to hand me this package. Well, I'm sorry, but you know, that's the reality of life. And if you're not sensitive to these kind of differences, you're going to overlook and you could be doing serious damage to people in various ways. So it's a process, I think, of learning culturally. And transgender people, as another example, stories, of course, are emerging in COVID of various people who are having particular difficulties in COVID. And this example around in Latin America, where the policy, which seemed sensible at the time, was to have shopping being allowed for essential items on alternate days. They had to get rid of that in the end because, of course, they found that on the days that women were shopping, it was just completely overloaded. And on the days when it was meant to be men, there wasn't very much happening. So people learned something. But in that process, of course, transgender people had to choose their day, and they were confronted with security guards who were trying to prevent them from entering shops on the wrong day. Just one of those things that people just didn't think about because they weren't thinking in this intersectional way. So this is from Alison Blanco, a transgender woman in Panama. And she really expresses the suffering that's going on with people on the verge of suicide because of this. And of course, without the sex and gender disaggregated data, often we just don't know. So we think about silencing, invisibilizing. Silencing has been around for a long time. You might have seen something like this before, the scold's bridle, where silencing is legitimated, institutionalized even. And this was from the early 17th century, when a lot of the technology for doing this emerged. But I discovered that this was still going on in 1900. This is a woman prisoner who's having this done to her. So, there's a long tradition of silencing and silencing women, particularly when they're apparently unruly and speaking out too much. But people are silencing women, particularly in many ways. And so you may know of this example from the Women's Voices Project in Christchurch. So the problem was that, as usual, I'm not going to jump on Deb's toes here because, she has really pushed this issue in particularly in relation to bushfires. I'm sure she'll mention it soon. The media focus on typical heroes and rescuers and responders, and it's, all the usual suspects. Where were the women? Where were the women's voices? And so this was a very interesting project in New Zealand, for which people who'd been through the earthquake, women who'd been through the earthquake, interviewed other women who'd been through the earthquake to get their stories. And as they say, after natural disasters, everyone has a story to tell. It should be left up to them when they want to tell that story, not having to tell, retell, and relive and re-experience traumatic experiences when they don't want to. But as the Women's Voices Project says, women's organizations are well placed to record all this ingenuity, determination, all of those things that women traditionally do in disasters. But inaction, doing nothing, is another form of silencing. So Virginie Lemasson and others, and there are some sources and references at the end. You can all have the slides and you can see where all of this came from. And they are arguing that inaction or poorly designed programs can also cause violence and create barriers to recovery. And now we move into violence. And of course, there are many kinds of violence. So I think when Hurricane Katrina happened, our screens made it very clear that there was a so-called third world within this principal first world country, and that race and ethnicity became quite prominent. But it was quite a long time actually before gender and race and other social characteristics emerged. And there are a lot of stories and a lot of things we could talk about around Katrina, but the picture at the top, on the top left, the looters shot, survivors shot again. This is what you faced, particularly if you were Black in white neighborhoods. And to be Black and female meant you were more likely to be in the Superdrome because you couldn't evacuate out of the city at the time of the crisis, and there was a lot of abuse and sexual violence then and subsequently. And of course, the lower Ninth Ward and other poorer, predominantly Black areas of New Orleans were the least able to evacuate. And subsequently, when people were given a ticket to leave, they were the ones that found it more difficult to come back. And there was this process, this gradual whitening of New Orleans, and problems with the social housing and projects that many poor people were living in, which were way down the line in terms of priority actions. So when we come to violence against women and girls, gender-based violence, as I said, it's relatively new in the field. If you take the field to be back to the 50s, say, in its current form. And although it's often it's often thought of as a problem for over there, somewhere else, significant increases in gender-based violence have been found in so many high-income countries, in all countries, really. So the IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, they have said in their recommendations, so assume gender-based violence is taking place, even if there are no reliable data. Develop the strategies to prevent and address gender-based violence in not only in organizational responses, but also in organizational cultures, and to take measures to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse by disaster responders themselves. So who can you trust in disasters? You must be able to trust the disaster responders, but there have been a number of occasions when you cannot. And the IFRC, their final point is that ensure that gender-based violence and safety of women and children are considered in all disaster preparedness and planning. And of course, I would add recovery. So the next slide is around COVID. And you may have seen, you may not have seen, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he called for measures to address, quotes, a horrifying global surge in domestic violence, which has been directed primarily at women and girls in lockdown. I suspect all sorts of violence is going to emerge. This is a familiar story, I'm sure, to so many of you who are in the meeting. And this was a shocking projection from the UNFPA, that if the lockdown continues for 6 months, then 31 million additional gender-based violence cases can be expected globally. That may not be such a surprise to you, but I can tell you it would be a surprise to most disaster researchers. And I think this is this quote from UNDP, which talks about pre-existing toxic social norms and gender inequalities. And now with this restricted movement, social isolation, and all sorts of other things, we've seen this exponential growth in GBV. There's current visibility for the issue of violence in disasters, specifically in COVID, but I wonder, will it last and will it be effective? Because people like Dr Parkinson, amongst others, have been proclaiming this problem, this concern, for a very long time. And you in Australia have actually done more about it than most other countries have. I'm always so impressed, actually, with what Australia has managed to do. It's a real model, actually, for other countries. So more positively is the next slide, the next heading, to say it's not all bad news. And I'm showing a picture of the thank you to the NHS, the National Health Service, and all key workers, and the rainbow that has become common, and a picture of a very diverse group of medical professionals. And what I'm saying is that typically the behavior in crises is as diverse as it is at other times. So you will get a majority of pro-social behavior, but you will also get plenty of antisocial behavior, as you will in the everyday. But in this process, specific social groups can be, I've said, demonized, victimized, invisibilized, or memorialized. And I think the group you can see in that picture have gone through all of this, because many of them are despised migrant labor who have been rejected and had very many barriers put in their place. And now suddenly it's turned around to an extent. So is this the usual disaster window of opportunity? It may provide a different lens to view people who normally are overlooked. And the literature tells us, the research tells us about the importance of social capital, social infrastructure. And an example of just one of many could be Japan in 2011, with the earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear meltdown. And Dan Aldrich's paper, references at the end, where he's talking about, when we're thinking about rebuilding and resilience, we're thinking about usually physical infrastructure. But he's arguing that resilience comes from our connections to others and not to the physical infrastructure so much. Because there's some interesting work, again, that he highlights, in Japan, where he's looked at parts of Japan that recovered well and others less well. And what he found was, in response, it was these horizontal social ties between people who know each other, between town residents locally, which was important for strengthening their coping behavior. But if you want to draw down resources, you need the vertical ties, and the ones that the communities that did best, they had already been sending senior representatives to Tokyo in the years prior to the disaster. So they'd made those connections, and they could benefit from the resources that came in. Japan has obviously spent a lot on physical infrastructure, less on social ties. But in that paper, interesting as it is, I wonder, where is the gender analysis? And another example from New Zealand is the Wellington Regional Emergency Management Office, REMO, where they have 3 core groups, and a third of their activity is around community resilience and recovery. They say they understand our focus is on people and a sense of community, and the importance of increasing connectedness. And the resilience team encourages, facilitates and supports community activity that doesn't, on the face of it, have anything to do with disasters and hazards, but does connect people. And in Japan, where they have done some work around the social infrastructure, Ibasho, where they're creating socially integrated and sustainable communities that value their elders. It's worth having a look at their website, and particularly having a look at their YouTube video. We don't have time to look at that, where you can see elderly, very often very elderly women in particular, playing a very active role, which is typically what they would be doing in communities at this local level. You can look at it in the USA. Eric Kleinenberg's done some very interesting work. His more recent book, Palaces for the People, about how social infrastructure can help fight inequality, polarization, and the decline of civic life. And what he's arguing there is you could just build a school, build a library or other physical infrastructure and just think about that physical shell. But if you think about the ways you can invite people in, all sorts of people, then you are building your social infrastructure, and that is much more important for resilience. And that links also to his earlier book on the Chicago heat wave, where elderly African-American men were more likely to die, as he argued, because of their lack of social networks at this local level. Again, why no gender analysis? I have asked Eric that and suggest he do a follow-up book with gender in it. So last thoughts now. So gender matters in disasters and the everyday, but gender analysis might still be left out. It still surprises me that we have to emphasize that disasters affect different people in different ways. And you often hear now, more women die than men in disasters. That is often the case, but not always the case. So we have to look at all of those examples, and you could look at, and again, it's the same kind of examples that come up again and again, because we have so few sex disaggregated data in disasters. So we have to keep giving the same examples. but Hurricane Mitch in Latin America, Nicaragua particularly, worse for men and boys because of risk-taking behavior. We've seen COVID-19, men and BAME people, Black and minority ethnic people, but often we don't have the data. Social roles and expectations reinforce stereotypes: the tough men who rescue, the homemaker women who cry, and that limits options for certain social groups. And I can give you examples just from my research locally in the UK around floods in all sorts of different parts of the UK, including up in Scotland, actually. And there is so much difference in there. And I'm going to shut up, you know, because I know that it's time for Deb and I need to move on. So I won't go through all of those, but it's some evidence for you in the background. So there's still a lot more to be done. Thank you for listening, and do feel free to contact me for any follow-up. There's another slide which says thank you and has my email on it. And there's a couple of slides afterwards that have some references and sources if people want to follow up on anything. Thank you, everybody. And sorry for talking so much.
Thank you, Maureen. On behalf of all of us, that was most informative, and I do apologise for that slight technical hiccup, but in the context of disaster, from what we've certainly just listened to, it's certainly not the worst thing in the world that can happen, a Zoom technical disaster, but I do appreciate all of your patience. There was a couple of comments in the chat room, but if people might be patient and we can come to those at the end of the session, there'll be an opportunity for those comments and questions to be asked. It's my great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Deb Parkinson. Deborah is an adjunct research fellow with Monash University Disaster Resilience Initiative, or MUDRI, and a researcher and manager of the Gender and Disaster Pod, or GAD, a collaboration between a number of different agencies. The GAD pod has received state, national and international awards for its focus on the gendered implications of natural disaster emerging from the Black Saturday bushfires. In 2015, Deborah was awarded the Social and Political Sciences Graduate Research Thesis Award from Monash University for her PhD on increased domestic violence after bushfires, which is of course a topic very relevant here in Victoria. Deborah is currently training violence prevention workforces on gender disaster and COVID-19. Deborah will discuss today gender and disaster and the learnings that she has from the bushfire crisis. We welcome Deborah. Thank you.
I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. Pandemics are one kind of disaster. 2020 is a year of disasters. It began with bushfires already raging. Just a few months ago, we saw horrific images of a coastline on fire and thousands of people displaced. An ANU study reported that 14% of Australians were directly affected and 75% indirectly affected. So an area greater than England burnt. Nearly 3,000 firefighters were killed. Nearly 3,000 firefighters were involved. 34 people were killed. And just yesterday, the Royal Commission heard an estimate that bushfire smoke killed 445 people and led to more than 3,000 heart and lung admissions to hospitals. More than 1 billion animals were killed and species threatened. More than 3,000 homes were destroyed, 6,000 people displaced, 61,000 registered by the Red Cross. There were 110 relief centres. Thousands of fires were burning in December to January, and toxic smoke pollution in Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra reached the worst air quality in the world. 21% of Australian forests burnt. As early as January 10th, The Australian Academy of Science wrote that the scale of these fires is unprecedented anywhere in the world. It's been terrifying to see the initial response to the 2020 Black Summer bushfires dwindle to insignificance compared to the coronavirus pandemic. Where are national and global commitments to addressing climate change? Locally, what happened to our obligations to support bushfire survivors? Media interviews with CEOs and mayors of fire-affected councils graphically report the financial impact of both fires and COVID shutdown. It's sending local businesses broke and affecting household incomes with unavoidable consequences of unpaid rates. The Mayor of East Gippsland, John White, was asked about the $2 billion allocated by the federal government for bushfire recovery, although from one of the worst affected shires, he said, "We've not received a great deal of it as yet." That was 2 weeks ago. In this and every previous disaster, politicians address the media in terms of community spirit and Australian resilience, while people look on, devastated at their loss. Young and old informants to our long-term disaster research felt let down by promises of help that did not eventuate. One said, "What was amazing was the politicians that came in and blew their own trumpets and told everyone how good they were, but then there was nothing." Our research showed that resilience, a flawed concept, depends on the basic provision of cleanups, water supply, power, and IT connection. Individuals can't do that. Governments must do this quickly to provide a base for people to help themselves and rebuild. Sadly, this does not appear to be happening for the survivors of the 2020 bushfires, as bureaucratic hoops and other agendas prevent funds getting to the people and organisations that need them. State and federal governments, as well as Red Cross, Salvation Army, St Vincent de Paul, prevaricate while people are left to their own resources. The process to deliver bushfire grants has been described as too complex, restrictive and opaque. David O'Loughlin, President of the Local Government Association of Australia, told ABC Radio on May 11th, there's been no clarity around funding and only 3% of the bushfire fund has so far made its way to local government. He fears the worst affected councils will run out of cash and might fall over in coming months. Cobargo business owner Andrew Hayden said, "The wait of more than 4 months to commence removing the debris has been frustrating. It's extremely depressing looking at it every day. I think a lot of the community has been struggling with PTSD and depression, and it seems to be worse now than immediately after the fires." The impact of disasters on local leaders is profound. Our research found that unpaid work around the clock took a heavy toll through a lack of practical and moral support. Leaders were faced with community members' grief and anger and were frequently blamed. For some, in the years that followed, unemployment and ill health emerged. Suicides were seen as a consequence of the disaster. Australian research last year found that 25% of the disaster survivors have serious mental health issues. The 2020 survivors are affected even more harshly as COVID-19 shutdown prevents many supports that were available even in 2009. Tragically, 5 days ago, a woman's body was found at a home in Bendock, a remote town in East Gippsland, and a 64-year-old man was charged with her murder. Bendock was temporarily cut off and residents evacuated during January's bushfires. Since 2009, our gender and disaster research has been informed by hundreds of people. This presentation draws on the research to show that gender determines risk, experience and legacy and should be central to the way disasters are understood and managed. Alongside the literature reviews and primary research with disaster recovery workers, women, men, LGBTI people and firefighters, our advocacy has included the Gender and Disaster Task Force and many conferences and journal articles. The training we developed over the past 8 years has now been moved to an online format retaining interactivity through Zoom chat rooms and polls, and with 2 facilitators in real time. The COVID pandemic and subsequent isolation is now included in this training. We are grateful to the Metropolitan Fire Brigade and to Steve O'Malley for helping with this GADPOD work. We're currently working with Respect Victoria to bring the training to primary prevention practitioners. We greatly appreciate their support. The first is tomorrow, and demand has led to a second lot of training next week. However, promised training contracts with Family Safety Victoria for bushfire case support coordinators is still uncertain. In the absence of subsidies, the CFA, the National Red Cross, and several local governments have contracted the gender and disaster training at full fee-for-service rates. Since March, we've been engaged with East Gippsland services where needs are high, again at fee-for-service. It seems wrong to charge these groups given the amount of money apparently allocated for community recovery. Why is there no funding for this sought-after training? Or for women's health services, or for women's health services across the state to employ gender and disaster workers as advocated by GenVic. In emergencies, the gender schema takes a 50-year setback. Men are seen everywhere, in uniform and in positions of authority. In June 2019, the Harvard Business Review reported that just 19% of people speaking in the media as experts are women. In bushfires, time-pressed journalists are sent to find sooty heroes and women with babes in arms. The tyranny of the urgent in emergencies can lead to unwelcome and regressive change. Already, there are incursions into women's rights in the name of coronavirus. There have been contraceptive supply shortages, attempts to curtail abortion in the US, ceasing monitoring of the gender pay gap in the UK, and in Australia, changes to workers' rights, which, although touted as temporary, are at risk of being permanently lost. Women will be greatly affected by this backward step, all in the name of a quick response to the economic fallout from coronavirus. It brings to mind Milton Friedman's concept that Maureen mentioned, the window of opportunity that disasters offer. History teaches us this is used to claw back hard-won gains by minority groups and to reinstate inequality to preserve male privilege. Reinforcing this, gender theorist Raewyn Connell commented that crises may provoke attempts to restore a dominant masculinity. Through social construction of gender, women are made vulnerable, such as through the myth of women and children first, in the caring role assigned to women, lack of autonomy in decision-making, exclusion from hazard survival education, and in disasters' aftermath through increased domestic violence. Men are also made vulnerable through the hero myth, risk-taking, overconfidence, loss of a sense of control, reluctance to seek help, and a failure to live up to expectations of protector during the disaster and provider after. For people of diverse sexual and gender identities, a lifetime of casual discrimination is a determining factor in disaster experience. LGBTI participants reported being verbally abused, fearing violence and harassment, and being discriminated against by organisations providing services after disaster. There are similar fears for LGBTI people in the corona context. The impacts of the pandemic are likely to be much greater on members of marginal populations, including LGBTI communities, as well as the aged, the young, Aboriginal people, refugees and migrants, and people with disabilities. Initially, as Tanya said, COVID appeared to be disproportionately killing older men worldwide, 50% male. However, young and middle-aged women, as the majority of healthcare workers, are at greater risk of contracting COVID. The myth of women and children first was exposed by Swedish researchers who examined 18 disasters over 3 centuries. They concluded that it is instead every man for himself, including on the Titanic, where 30% of the women and children on board drowned, and males were 40% of survivors. In the same way, our cultural understanding of men fighting fires and women and children out of harm's way does not reflect reality in this century. In Australia, the statistic that 3 times as many men die in bushfires is regularly and misleadingly touted. This is only true if you look at the last 100 years. Instead, the more relevant 50 years to 2008 shows bushfire deaths of 40% female, increasing to 42% on Black Saturday. Rather than being protected, women and children are often alone, escaping fires in terrifying and life-threatening conditions. Women's choices are constrained. While responsibility for children or the elderly hampers escape, another barrier is women's lack of autonomy in deciding to leave. Cultural norms have historically positioned the man as head of the household, and this affects women's freedom to evacuate. Ben told us, most of the blokes would have said, this is my bloody house, I built it, I worked my ass off for the last 25 years, I'm not leaving this joint. And the wife would say, are you sure we're going to be all right? Yeah, we'll be right. And I know a few families that perished like that. Our fire planning with gendered lens postcards encourage couples to recognise these gender-based dangers. 30,000 of these cards were posted out upon request across Victoria last November. So a barrier to fire planning is that we reward enactment of masculinity that's strong, fearless and risk-taking. Yet men who were career firefighters told how loss of control in the catastrophic fires undermined their confidence and led to shame and remorse in the aftermath. As one woman said of her husband, they were the professional firefighters. It was their job to stop the unstoppable. They bear the grief and the loss and the guilt. And I could see him reliving those moments where he could have done something and saved a life. The effect on many of the men in this research was to erode their sense of identity. If they felt they'd failed as protector, they had failed as a man. And men were expected to be heroic. One woman said to Dr. Rob Gordon, I wanted a man who would protect me or die in the attempt. Like the COVID isolation, Black Saturday was accompanied by grief, loss, trauma, homelessness or overcrowding, red tape, unemployment, alcohol abuse and relationship breakdown. Pressures as people tried to return to work and re-establish their lives were exacerbated by the unrealistic gender-based expectations. One man explained, expectations, okay, to get things back to normal, to make things better, to rebuild. And I think to appear effective, and Christ, the men really needed to appear as if they were effective, productive, constructive members of the community. The risks to men's health included alcohol abuse, depression, isolation and reclusiveness. Men's reluctance to talk about trauma and the stigma associated with counselling were strong themes. This is known as double jeopardy. The masculine ideal is impossible to meet, but help can't be sought because real men don't admit any weakness. There are good reasons for this. Our society monitors enactment of gender roles, and there are career penalties and loss of status for men who show emotion other than anger. One man said when he cried at work, his colleague said, I thought you were more of a man than that, Pete. The researchers have drawn a direct link between men's perceived failure to live up to their own or society's expectations and domestic violence. Our research with women after Black Saturday found that all 30 women spoke of increased family violence, 17 personally affected, 16 were afraid of their partner. For 9 women, there was no violence before the fires, and 7 said they were previously very happy. Most research informants knew of male violence in the relationships of friends and neighbours. One said, our street was replete with domestic violence. Yet actual reports of DV decreased. The same situation is occurring now with the COVID isolation. After Black Saturday, women spoke of seeking help with no positive outcome. With family, they were ignored, accused of overreacting, and blamed for not caring well enough for their men. As devastated communities sought to show resilience and loyalty to one another, there were unhelpful responses to women disclosing DV by legal, community, and health professionals. One woman said, "I'll get out of here in a box." Echoing this, in the 3 weeks to the 12th of April, Counting Dead Women in the UK recorded 16 deaths of women and children in COVID lockdown. This is an increase of over 300% compared to the average over the previous decade. With coronavirus, there's a greater willingness to address the increase in DV. Announcing funding for helplines, Prime Minister Scott Morrison referred to a 75% increase in Google searches for DV support. Calls to the Men's Referral Service increased by 94% on the day Stage 3 restrictions were announced. Yet, like the bushfire context, reporting from women in COVID isolation has decreased. Figures vary and hard statistics are rare. A document for police leaders released last week showed inconsistent results, but stats showed police reporting is down in parts of the UK, the US and Australia. While calls to DV support services increased slightly, website and email contact increased exponentially. 2 national UK services report around 25% increase in calls and 125 to 150% increase in website hits. Spain reports 18% increase in calls and an amazing 286% increase in email contact. Calling 000 won't bring peace, so women appease perpetrators until they can see a way out. 1 million Australians have been made unemployed or are unexpectedly working from home. Others face lost income through property or shares. There's greater drug and alcohol abuse, loss of services and support networks, and loss of routine. These circumstances also confronted Black Saturday survivors and increased risk to women and children. Survivors of the 2020 Black Summer are living through a cumulative effect. So what to do about it at a local level? Adopt the National Gender and Emergency Management Guidelines. They were funded by the Victorian and federal governments and contributed to by around 500 emergency management personnel. Hosted on the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience Knowledge Hub, they outline how to address the central role of gender in emergencies. Key strategies are collecting gendered data, inclusion of women and gender diversity specialists at every level of planning, response and recovery, and training your staff and communities in gender and disaster. I'll conclude with 4 ways to bring our gender schema into this century. 1, disentangle masculinity from firefighting. In Victoria, attempts to raise the proportion of women firefighters fail year after year. Women have proven themselves highly effective in 21st century firefighting, characterised as it is by teamwork and assisted by equipment and technology. Failure to raise female participation is not through lack of interest or ability in women, but through bastions of male power preventing it. 2, stop expecting men to protect the home and women to sacrifice their health and well-being. Identify these as outdated notions that put people's lives at risk. 3, let men be vulnerable. And 4, ensure women and children's right to live free from violence is unconditional, even after disasters. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. That was terrific. Now, we've got a little bit of time for questions. We are running slightly over. We've not had that many come through the chat room, but I would invite Meg Bagnall. You had a comment when Maureen was talking. Would you like to speak to that now? If Meg is still with us, perhaps I'll just read that comment out. It was more a comment and it was around wartime, Maureen, and the fact that the evidence of wartime was that it was an environment that increased employment opportunities for women. But in the COVID-19 situation, there have been reports to suggest that that's been the opposite experience for women. And I guess just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yes, in fact, some recent research in the US has shown that although more men are dying, more women's businesses are being affected. I don't know the mechanisms for that specifically. You could hypothesize about why that would be, particularly because women are often in insecure part-time employment, not very secure, and unlikely to be able to benefit from a lot of the compensation measures that have been announced. So they're losing out in that sense. I noted, I didn't see the name, but somebody asked on the chat about philanthropy.
Julie Miley, I think, might have asked that question.
Yeah, I don't actually have an answer about philanthropy, but what I do know is that there's been a huge growth in volunteer action. And that, in fact, was also the case after the Kobe earthquake in Japan in 1995, which rather changed some aspects of social organization in Japan to encourage more community-based organizing. But you never know, going back to the window of opportunity, just how quick that window is going to shut, and it often does. And the example of more women's work during wartime is a perfect example of that, where it shut immediately afterwards when men were returning home and their need for their jobs was privileged over the women who were already working in those industries, etc. It's the usual kind of gender power dynamics that play out in disasters as they do in the everyday.
Thank you, Maureen. We have also a question from Suzette Mitchell. That was a little earlier in the session. Suzette, did you want to speak to that?
Hi, I could put my camera on too. Thanks so much, both Maureen and Deb. Brilliant. And I think it's so important that we have the global context of all of the gender and disaster work that you've been doing over the decades, Maureen. You're such a legend in the sector, and Deb, you're our local legend. And one of the things from, I know that the role of women in decision making within disaster work globally has always been something that's been talked about, particularly in the Sendai framework for action. But do you think that the incredible leadership of women prime ministers and presidents is going to have an impact on how this is addressed in the future? Because it seems a lot of the media attention has shown how much more effective women leaders have been in this context. And I was just wondering on your thoughts on that, Maureen.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? That travel around the globe, the obvious successes of the women leaders. And it's great that there's a spotlight being put on that, because there are numerous examples of strong women's leadership in usually at a lower than national level, usually at a more local level. But it still doesn't get the same kind of recognition. I think again the media, is wondering, well, where's the story in this? It's a story at the moment. Jacinda Ardern, of course, has kind of really forged ahead on that. But I don't know whether it's going to be a kind of a sea change, an opportunity for a sea change in the way we think about this. I don't think it'll happen unless we try and make it happen. I think you have to kind of seize these opportunities and seize the platforms and hold on to them as far as you can, because there's going to be another story tomorrow. It's going to wipe it. That sounds a bit depressing, but it's just it seems cyclical. You go through it so many times. What do you think, Deb?
I think it's amazing. Like when you think of someone like Jacinda Ardern, I think we in Australia all want her to be our Prime Minister. Yeah, and I suppose after doing the research for DELP about barriers to women in leading firefighting positions, they had to behave like men, to be promoted. And it seemed that a lot of the women were out machoing the men, as a survival tactic. So I don't necessarily think that, I don't think any of us think that just having a woman is enough. It needs to be a woman with that different set of values.
Absolutely.
Could I add something to that? I think what's really interesting in this space is that it's very rare to have all of these metrics and indicators to measure leadership in the way that we have. So at the moment we have got death rates and illness rates, and we're going to have economic data to actually measure. Is there a difference between what is largely collaborative, feminised leadership being displayed in some of the Nordic countries and in New Zealand, or this very sort of macho hero leadership that is being displayed in the UK and the US? And so I imagine that there's going to be quite a lot of academic research that looks at the significance of that, and it's going to be very interesting for future gender equity work and also leadership work, I imagine. I'm very conscious that we're running out of time today, and I wanted to thank Maureen and the late hour that it is in London, and Deb for their expertise today. Thank you so much for everything that you have brought and for the insights that you've provided. It would be remiss of me not to also make mention of some of the commentary that has taken place on the chat about where has the inspiration and the drive for gender and disaster lens in Victoria come from. And it's really come from women's health services that have had that leadership role within the prevention partnerships to drive innovation and to drive localised solutions. So just picking up on Helen Riseborough's observations, Helen's the CEO at Women's Health in the North, that it was Women's Health in the North and Women's Health Goulburn North East that created the GAD-POD with very small amount of money. It is nationally, internationally and locally world-leading piece of work. And we're really excited, GenVic is really excited to be calling now at a state level for there to be a scale up of this work and for there to be a gender and disaster workforce. That, because let's face it, pandemic is one thing. I'm hoping there's not going to be too many more pandemics in my lifetime. But I think that the prospect of there being multiple bushfires, droughts, and climate change disaster is huge. And so there is going to continue to be a need for there to be a gendered lens in the way that we manage emergency management, our health responses, and build. And I think of all the things that I really heard today, the thing that I found really deeply interesting is the importance of community connectedness and localized, unique delivery in that community connectedness, which just reaffirms to me the role that you're all playing in your 500 organisations that are represented by all of your work that you are here today on this webinar. So thank you very much for your work. All power to you. Please check in with GenVic's regular Friday e-bulletin, Gender Disaster and Resilience e-update. You can log on and subscribe to that. And if you haven't, if your organisation hasn't signed up to the Gender Equity and COVID-19 Joint Statement, we would also encourage you to do that as well. There are a number of recommendations in relation to women's economic security and gender and disaster that we commend to you and your organisations. Catherine, is there something that you would like to add to before we finish up today?
I will, thank you, Tanya. I would, on behalf of the VLGA, also like to thank Maureen and Deborah and everyone who's attended today. And just to really reinforce what Tanya said, from the VLGA's perspective, our purpose is to support effective local governance. Good local government is defined by good governance, and without that gender lens at that local level, I think that we're unable to, in fact, progress all of the things that we've been talking today. And that's why the VLGA is in this space, and that's why we're working very closely with organisations like GenVic, and we look forward to that ongoing relationship. Thank you, Tanya.